Labors of Hercules. Introduction. How Hercules was set to work. Truisms are superfluous. Though this assertion is a truism, it is needless, therefore, to remind that we are now living in the millennium. Oppression is unheard of, injustice unknown. As for poverty, we never mention it. Peace and plenty everywhere prevail, and charity reigns paramount throughout the world. There was, however, once a time, when men lied, cheated, tyrannized, cut each other's throats, and picked one another's pockets, when one class surfeited and another starved, when Dives in his mansion, arrayed in purple and fine linen, stuffed himself into a monstrosity, and Lazarus in the workhouse, in pauper uniform, and on the coarser kind of food, was famished into a skeleton. To have attained, therefore, to its present state of blessedness, the world must have undergone a glorious reformation. How came this about? Through Hercules, who wrought a second series of labors for the express purpose. Jupiter, from his armchair in sublimest ether, looking down on the navigable ocean and on the earth, spread like mister. Wilds altas beneath him, beheld rascality pervading land and sea. We say sea, advisedly, for there were nautical naughtiness as well as land villainies in those days. And it was impossible even for the British tar to touch pitch and not be defiled. All this Jupiter seeing, he flew for the 10,000,000th time into a great fury, and indignantly grasped his thunder. But recollecting how often he had tried that remedy without effect, and considering that when you fire on a mob it is a chance whom you hit and whom you miss, he put it down again and scratched his head. What is to be done with those fellows? Said Jupiter. Minerva, you have a head of your own, how shall I put them to rights? The blue-eyed goddess assumed an attitude of reflection, and after a few moments' thought, touched her alabaster forehead with the ivory tip of her forefinger, and cried, I have it. Father of the gods and men, send your son Hercules among them with his club. He will soon settle their affairs. Hercules with his club, exclaimed Jupiter. I don't see, daughter, what he is to do with that. He might kill monsters with it, but how is he to redress wrongs? Wrongs, answered the goddess, are monsters. There are giant wrongs upon earth. Hercules shall slay the giants with his club. With the same instrument, too, he shall beat sense and reason into the heads of the sons of men. Jupiter flung up his crown into the air and caught it, danced thrice round the celestial hall, oscula libavit nate, as Virgil hath it, in plain English, kissed his daughter, and called out for Hercules at the top of his lungs. Here you are, governor, cried the deep-toned voice of the deified hero, anything in my way. Toujours prêt, you know. Don't talk French, boy, said Jupiter, the language is not heroic. What I want you to do, is just to step down to that ball of earth there, and put yonder disorderly rabble to rights with your Malacca. Minerva says you can do it. Can you? Why, you are omniscient, sire, answered Hercules, of course you know best. Yes, yes, said Jupiter, with a slight cough, I merely made the inquiry conventionally. But never mind that, verbosity is inadmissible when delays are dangerous. So, without more ceremony, oblige me, and be off about your business. Amputate your cane. If I do that, thought Hercules, how am I to make use of it? He kept however this reflection to himself, and with all alacrity complied with the request of his father. He alighted, after a very pleasant journey through the azure deep of air, upon Primrose Hill. It strikes me, observed the demigod, as he was preparing himself for his adventures, that I am remarkably like Don Quixote, only a little stouter. Chapter 1. The First Labor. How Hercules slew the red lion, fellow to and feller than the lion of Nemea. The first monster that Hercules attacked was a formidable and ferocious lion, to which the Nemean lion, to say nothing of the lion Wallace, was a mere kitten. This lion was not a four-legged lion, indeed he was soon not a legged lion at all, for Hercules left him not a leg to stand upon. He was a biped brute, but such a brute. He had a scarlet coat, with a sort of yellow fringe upon each shoulder, and he wore, in place of a mane, a stiff black collar about his neck. His head was surmounted by a kidney-shaped, comb-like excrescence of black felt, from which sprung great plumes, as of feathers, white and red. His dexter forepaw, or hand, was armed with a weapon of iron ever dripping with purple gore. His eyes flashed lightning, and he breathed out fire and smoke and red-hot cannonballs. He strode among crushed and mangled carcasses, through burning cities and over blood-bedabbled decks, and he trampled on the dying and the dead. Around him were yelling and blasphemy, shouts of rage and screams for mercy. Legions of his cubs, ferocious as himself, followed him. They hauled delicate and tender women by the hair over flinty streets, tore little children to pieces, and cleft feeble old men to the chine. He had desolated earth and scandalized heaven for ages. He was a murderer from the beginning, and his name was War. Men committed idolatry to this lion. They sung hymns to his praise and glory, and they suspended trophies in his honor in their houses of prayer. They glorified his very cubs. They dressed them out in fine clothes to make them look handsome, and they called them grand names: captains, colonels, generals, and field marshals, and some they worshipped under the name of lords. The ladies smoothed them down, and patted them on the back, and smiled upon them, and toyed with them, and made much of them, to the no small envy of their own peaceable admirers. They would rush to windows to see a herd of them go by, strutting, prancing, and looking fierce, taut sound of trumpet and drum, and they would kiss their hands to them from balconies in high places. In short, they aided, abetted, and comforted them to the very utmost of their power. These whelps of the Red Lion would sometimes march under the command of a leader to a temple or place of worship, where it was often proclaimed in their presence that all they who took the sword should perish by the sword, but their brute natures prevented them from understanding what they heard. Moreover, they were strictly prohibited from even attempting to think, and had any one of them acted on the doctrine in question, he would have been destroyed by the rest without mercy. In order to check the slightest tendency in their minds towards reflection, they were never allowed to move except to noisy and boisterous music, which kept them in a state of mental intoxication highly antagonistic to rationality. This was very expedient, for even a brute, if it came to think and meditate on the sensations accompanying the having its entrails torn out, or its limbs crushed into a jelly, and on the commodiousness of a wooden leg, would hardly be inclined to put itself in the way of such pleasantnesses for 13 pence a day, even though it should be dressed up and tricked out, and called a fine fellow into the bargain. To keep the cubs in order was not always easy, and it was oftentimes necessary, even for a trifling misdemeanor, to tie one of them up to a stake and whip the hide off the creature's bones, for the edification of all the rest and the amusement of the casual looker-on. Now that these animals and their sire must have been a great nuisance, the abatement of which would be no small boon to society, is very obvious and apparent. Their own existence being involved in that of their parent, to destroy the old Red Lion was to annihilate his progeny. What Hercules had to do, therefore, was to knock War on the head. In the case of the Nemean lion, he did this at once, but in the present instance, he adopted a more circuitous course. He had a harder job to do this time. He found that the lion, War, was fed and maintained upon certain errors and prejudices, which he would previously have to knock out of people's heads. This, therefore, he first set to work to accomplish. With his omnipotent club, which the reader must know was a moral and intellectual club, a punch club, in fact, he beat and drove out of the heads of the nations the fallacy that there was anything fine in the nature of this beast. He took out of the glory of War, and showed them that it should rightly be called gory. He divested the evil of the magnitude which gave it sublimity in pygmy eyes. He pummeled it into a small thing, and then men found it willful murder, and saw that it was bad. By dint of the argumentum baculinum, to wit, ridicule, he convinced mankind, and womankind too, that the epaulet and the shoulder knot were cousins german, and uniforms became in their sight as liveries. He took a child's drum and beat it, and he squeaked through a penny trumpet about the streets, till at last people laughed at the Coldstream band. He corked his eyebrows and stuck mustaches on his upper lip, and dressed himself up in a cocked hat and a scarlet coat like the monkey of an Italian organ boy, and so walked up and down Regent Street with the air of Lord Bateman, no policeman daring to take him up winking face, and wherever he went, he cocked his chin and swore oaths. The boys followed him at first, but they soon took to following the commander-in-chief also. When he found himself in the company of sensitive females, he would describe the processes of racking, breaking on the wheel, impalement, burning alive, and other similar modes of pleasurably exciting the nervous system, which, as history informs us, were formerly in vogue. Until the sweet creatures grew sick, and pale, and faint, with horror and disgust. And then he hammered into their soft heads the perception that bayonets, shots, shells and rockets, were precisely similar in their operation to the tools of the common hangman. He expatiated in all companies on the beauty of the precept, "Love your enemies," which we do not observe now only because we have no enemies to love. Winking face, love. Winking face explained the compatibility of its observance with cutting their throats, ripping up their stomachs and dashing out their brains. And cited the example of a drunken Irishman at Donnybrook Fair, to show how reasonable and sensible such conduct was. He described the march of an invading army, and the taking of a town by storm, and drew a very pretty and pleasing picture of the blazing cornfields and rafters, and the massacred inhabitants. He gave graphic delineations, writhings and agonies resulting from the operation of cold steel, lead and fire, upon the human body, and would conclude a homily upon this subject by a grave proposal for the restoration of the worship of Moloch. At last men's eyes were opened, and even the French perceived war to be a mistake, and laughed at the humbug of glory. The lion was now a poor, weak, driveling, impotent savage, and Hercules quietly choked him.